Um, Welcome all of you, and I'm very happy to have Professor Maroona Murmu and Shuvatri Dasgupta with us today. So they will be discussing Professor Murmu's book, Words of Our Own: Women Authors in 19th Century Bengal. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I will just start the session. So, Shuvatri Dasgupta received a Kolkata. She was also an exchange student and Charpak Fellow at Sciences for Paris, studying for a certificate program in European Affairs and B1 French. She is currently the editor for the blog of the Journal of History of Ideas and a doctoral candidate in the Faculty of History, University of Cambridge. Her doctoral research is funded by the Cambridge Trust and Rajiv Gandhi Foundation Fellowship. At Cambridge, she is currently the convener of the Histories of Race graduate workshop and a research network titled Grammars of Marriage and Desire. Her dissertation is tentatively titled A History of Conjugality on Patriarchy, Caste, and Capital in the British Empire, 1872 to 1947. Her general research interests include global history, gender history, intellectual history and political thought, histories of empire, histories of capitalism, Marxist, and Marxist feminist theory and critical theory. Thank you so much. So I guess we could start. Um, so the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Am I audible? Thank you, Shansali, for that very kind
Yes,
and
you are.
generous introduction, and also for inviting me here today to be in conversation with Professor Murmu. It is indeed a huge honor, actually, to share this virtual space. Professor Maroona Murmu is currently a professor of history at Jadavpur University. After her bachelor degree from Presidency College, Calcutta, she received her master's, MPhil, and PhD degrees from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has written a number of articles on gender studies in colonial India and the caste question in Bengal in journals and edited volumes. Apart from anti caste activism, she engages in issues concerning Adivasi gender understanding. Now, this is a rather modest introduction for someone like Professor Murmu, who is who inspire us every day with radical acts of resistance, which bridge the divisions between pedagogy and activism, and between personal and political. From my end, there will be more on this later, but for now, Professor Murmu will introduce her book and give an overview of some of her extremely fascinating arguments. So, the virtual stage is all yours, Ornadi. You're still on. You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Yeah. So, thank you, Shanchali and N Narratives, for giving us this space. I had uh, always wanted to hear what Shuvatri had to say, simply because she's one of the first few who said they wanted to review my book, and what greater opportunity than this? Thank you so much, Shanchali. And okay, so I'll just say a few words about my book, why I decided to take it up, and why I think I don't know what its contribution has been, and but why I worked on it. Okay, generally against the marginalization and silencing of women's narrative in dominant literary discourse and conventional history writing, this book of mine, it probes stratagems of survival that enabled women authors to negotiate the male-dominated literary arena. I've taken up the period 1850 to 1900 simply because one finds about 300 books that were authored by Hindu and Brahmin women. Now, all these writings are listed under the categories of art, biography, drama, fiction, history, language, poetry, philosophy, religion, science, and travel in the Bengal Library Catalogue of Books, which was appended to the Calcutta Gazette. Now, during the same period, we've also find that certain periodicals were devoted to women's issues, which were edited by women themselves. Women even appeared as critiques in journals like Shaityo, Navbharot, Utshaho, Bharati between 1890 to 1900. Now, if one makes a quantitative analysis of books, one would see that women wrote poetry most, followed by novels, dramas, didactic essays. Now, I have taken up just a few genres and I couldn't have covered all. So I took up discursive tracts, autobiographies, diaries, and novels to situate diverse feminine experiences and its articulation in the wider endeavor to understand larger context of historical changes that were going on in so-called Renaissance Bengal. Now, one of the primary queries of this book is to look into catalysts that led to the emergence of women authors as a distinct, continuous, ever growing category for the first time, the sociocultural incentives behind the production and circulation of women authored texts. Now, language and literature became very important to the creation of socio-political and cultural identity and respectability of both the Bhadraloks and Bhadra Mohila. Bengal being the first seat of vernacular press, we see women with whatever little institutional education they had, they utilized the print culture as a potent medium of expression of their thoughts and writings. Now, if you look at average print run of books authored by women, they were between 1,000 to 2,000, but some of them, like those of Mankumari Bosu's Bangali Ramonidikeর Grihadharma or Swarnakumari Devi's Golpo Sholpo, the press run went up to 5,000, which indicates a proof of readership as also a market for books authored by women. Now, if multiple editions and reprints are taken to be indicators of an author's popularity, then Swarnakumari Devi and Ginindra Mohan Dashi, they emerge as most reputed women authors during the period. Now, if one goes through a price list, one does not even get a clear indication of disparity in price of books based on gender. So, one would say that there was uh, a demand for books written by women. Now, the first chapter looks into archives, how one can glean data out of archives and weave them with women's own words so that they could create their own agency. The second chapter is on discursive tracts, where I have tried to show how literary genres like discursive tracts they fitted into the larger project of envisaging a modern nation, uh, how the concept of domesticity and the household were connected, the household being called the embryonic nation, uh, how women with didactic prescriptions were critical about exploitative structures of power embedded in the hegemonic ideology of Hindu domesticity. Now, what I have done in the text is I've taken up Kailash Bashini Devi's diary, Hindu Mohilaganer Hinabastha, and Sharna Kumari Gupta's, sorry, these are all discursive tracts, uh, and Sharna Kumari Gupta's Usha Chinta অর্থাৎ আধুনিক আর্য মহিলার অবস্থা সম্বন্ধে কয়েকটি কথা. Now, as the titles of the books suggest, the ideal nationalist household was overwhelmingly imagined to be a Bengali Hindu one. Uh, but this idealized Bhadramola existence and the desirable domesticity that was created by the uh, male nationalists in the discursive space was at times challenged by uh, women's actual living condition and what they had to say about their status in the colonial patriarchal setup. Uh, in most of the texts that I have seen, there's in the preface one finds that there's an apology for forced assertion of identity in print. They say that they have entered the public realm of print culture, but are apologetic about such a fundamental breach of feminine propriety, which dictated invisibility of women in public space. Uh, mm, Perhaps as a defense for opening up the private and social life of women for public scrutiny, women categorically asserted that it was some male member in the family who had compelled them to gain access to the male preserve of learning. Now, in the advertisement of text, Kailash Vashni profusely thanks Bama Sundari Devi, who wrote the first Bengali discursive tract, Kiki Kusanskar Tirohito Hoile, Edeshe Shribidri Hoite Parbe. Now, this was written in 1816, and this was a critical piece about women's literacy, illiteracy, unhygienic labor rooms, misinformed childcare, events of early marriage, Kulin polygamy, deprivation of child widows, Shastric injunctions against foreign travel, caste commensality rules. Uh, and we find that these are repeated in the concerns that were taken up by Kailash Bashani Devi. And we find that she is very concerned about inequality that is uh, forced on a girl child right from the birth, because the dhai, or when she was delivered, the girl was the thigh of the girl was paid half than that of the boy child. And she goes on to talk about the uh, problem of loveless conjugality. One of the major concerns why women have been forced into miserable condition according to her, and she links up illiteracy, child marriage, couldn't polygamy, widowhood. And she goes on to say that nuptial love is on the verge of extinction in our country. And she argues that in the absence of Congress marriages, it is absolutely unimaginable how uh, women are supposed to ensure conjugal love and domestic happiness. Uh, she also prescribes the age of marriage to be 24 boys and 13 and 14 for girls, which preempts the Sarda Act of 1929. So she's much ahead of her times. Uh, she talks about celibate widowhood, the vulnerability, privation, and lack of dignity in widowhood. Now, in this critical piece, one finds a strange combination of conformity, complicity, as well as critique or opposition to patriarchal beliefs. This was perhaps an attempt not to alienate reformist endeavors, because that at least gave the opportunity for public articulation about private world of women. Now, the next text, Shonamoy Gupta's Usha Chinta, uh, this was mostly based on Shastric injunctions, how, and she was, uh, in her perspective, she was very different from Kailash Bashani Devi, because she did not desire a future designed according to a modernizing project that would entail protective interventionism of the colonial state. So that India could be elevated in the reckoning of civilized notion. So what she prescribed is initiative of indigenous patriarchy, and throughout the text we find how she compares the ancient Hindu past, where women had a freer life compared to that under colonial regime. she both Sharnamoyi and Kailash Bashini, uh, we find they appeal for restructuring of fundamental social relations and Hindu institutions so that men are entrusted with equal responsibility in making an orderly home. Uh, the next chapter is on autobiography, and here I've tried to show how women who had to play multidimensional gendered roles in their lives produce uh, incoherent, ununified agencyal subjectivity that is fragmentary and disconnected, something which is a reflection of their own life. The recreation of self through this self chosen past lacks harmony and wholeness. In fact, it attempts to disrupt the patriarchal discourse of linearity uh, that one sees in autobiographies. And I've taken up a diary, Kailash Vaishnavi Mitra's Janaka Grihavadu diary and Sharada Sundari Devi's Attakatha, to illustrate how historical conditions, material forces, cultural discourses, ideological practices in the 19th century endowed personhood to women so that they could construct themselves as uh, autonomous, authorial selves talking about their lives. Now, in both the texts, what we find is that the both of them belong to very influential families of Renaissance Bengal. Kailash Bashini Devi being the wife of Kishori Chand Mitra, the first district magistrate of Kolkata, and Sharada Sundar Devi being the mother of Keshav Chandra Sen. Now, in both these texts, we find how contemporary historical circumstances, social institutions, and cultural agendas conditioned their thoughts and feelings and the life they led. Uh, Personal conflicts with their husband or son on religious and social issues reflect in microcosm the social drama that was enacted in the larger sociocultural macrocosm. So we get to relate the mechanics by which uh, 19th century society was affecting the lives of individual women uh, whose counterparts filled the glorious pages of history. Now, Kailash Bashini Devi, in her text, she tries to fashion herself as an ideal Bhadra Mohila who enjoyed a companionate marriage with her husband and having got the protection, security, and comfort from her marriage. She is confident enough to talk about her unhindered um, compassion and care for her husband. Uh, but we find in text the rhetoric of wifeliness did come with a vocal commitment to wifely restrictions. Uh, she does acknowledge limitedness of female solidarity and sisterhood because there was no free social interaction. Uh, now, we also find how Kishori Chand coming to Kolkata was associated with the radical fears of young Bengal, how his lifestyle changed, and how there was a breach in the mental worlds of the couple, and how she says that she has to go on to symbolically follow Hindu rituals without being convinced about uh, their basic validity because a woman could not stay without the uh, communitarian lives they had to live within the family. Now, the sort of temporality and historicity of the text is interesting because she writes. She starts writing as if this is a travelogue as her husband passes on through various places of her posting, and we find that being founded on happiness of conjugal relationship, the diary abruptly ends with the death of her husband and beginning of her widowhood at the age of 43. So it seems that though she had upheld ascetic widowhood as an embodiment of traditional virtues, continuous uh, glorified valorization of pain, she could not take the strain of widowhood, and she does not write anything about her life, the rest of the life that she led. Now, Sharada Sundari Devi's Atmakatha was a dictated autobiography to her grandson-in-law Jogendranath Khastagir. We find that while Jogendranath tried to uh, use the words of Sharada Sundari to uh, talk about Keshav Chandra Sen and the followers of Nabobidhan Brahmo Samaj, we find that Keshav Chandra Sen is not the pivot of his mother's narrative. What is interesting about this text is that autobiographies, even if they are dictated, they're supposed to be portrayals of truth. But we find Sharada Sundari's autobiography is socially conditioned, I'd say, by faulty recollection, conflicting accounts, evasive silences, contradictions, because I believe truth and authenticity is a cultural construct. So, the feminine attributes of shame, modesty did not allow her tell to tell everything that she wanted to say. One of the major features of the this dictated autobiography is about marriages, and interestingly, she does not talk about patrilineal genealogy, paternal or maternal family relations that one sees at the beginning of autobiographies, and she begins at a juncture where there is translocation, where we find she's married and there's a burden of domesticity on her young shoulders, uh, and she relates about she talks about the fears and anxieties of a child bride and how she was widowed, and how her in-laws tried to take away her property. The other marriage which finds a distinction is that of Maharani Shuniti Devi, the one that created the schism in Brahmo Samaj and brought about the Navobidhan Brahmo Samaj. But even then, she goes on to say that much has been written about it and she doesn't want to talk about it. The only marriage that she is very happy about is that in about her youngest daughter Panna, where she writes that I choose the partner because, as was the case, it's the patriarch, patriarchy which decided who is to be married to whom. And we find the religious dilemma of the text is very interesting because we find she at times tries to talk about her Vaishnava lineage that she had, and the sort of influence that Keshav Chandra had on her. She talks about caste prejudices being violated while one travels during pilgrimages, and we find that Sharda Sundari lived all facets of a culturally inscribed ideal Bengali woman in a joint family. In 19th century Bengal, she was a subjugated child bride, a compliant daughter-in-law, a self-sacrificing wife, an oppressed widow, an understanding mother, and then as if she realized the futility of such subject positions, and then she empowered herself with speech. The next chapter is on novels. Now, the rigid class, caste, and gender hierarchies in Bengal uh, did not allow the space for writing um, novels which emerged out of ideals of individualism and realism in Europe. Conditions of political servility, economic deprivation, social constraints actually made the birth of novel difficult in India. And when the women took to writing novels, uh, what they wrote was basically about multifarious sufferings, inequalities and injustices, colonism, adultery, sexual excesses of husbands, lovers, all kinds of patriarchal oppression. But I chose to take up two texts, Kushum Kumari Rai Chaudhury's Sneholata and Shanu Kumari Devi's Kahake, simply because they try to redefine the notion of love. They do not want to remain as glorified, chaste women, self sacrificial entities. And we find in Sneholata, the protagonist actually tries to resist the marriage that was forced on her by not allowing her husband to consummate the marriage, and she died at the end. Kushum Kumari Rajyoti Sneholata is followed by Sharna Kumari Devi's Kahake, which I think is one of my favorites, simply because it has a lot to say about how women chose the concept of love to question patriarchy. And the novel opens with a quote from the canto of Lord Byron's poem Don Juan. Man's love is of man's life a thing apart. It is the woman's whole existence. And then the narrator says how her creed of love is very different from the societal paradigm of love being unique, once in a lifetime affair. Uh, she confesses that she loved even before her marriage, and she did so without the thought of getting married to this person. She goes on to say it was not her first love, it was not her last love, because her heart was never vacant. So, now, Mrinalini is a daring female subject who could transcend moral value of a woman being judged in terms of monogamous love. Uh, she as the story goes, she was rejected by a doctor who wanted to take her back, but she did not accept that negotiated marriage because this doctor was, sorry, this barrister was engaged to another lady, and she problematizes patriarchal desire for monopolistic claim over woman's love. Uh, and I'll read this because I find it interesting. She said, "The man who is the object of my forgiveness can never be my lover, my husband. Just as a man desires eternal, untarnished purity from his wife, yearns everlasting devotion, I too want to possess his entire existence as mine. I can pardon him. I can even marry him if need be, but he cannot enter the sanctuary of my being. Will such a manly feeling of a woman be treated with compassion?" Now, apart from uh, her experimenting with various notions of love, uh, what is interesting about the text is her claiming authorial recognition, and we are almost thrown into a comparison between George Eliot and William Shakespeare to compare who's the best novelist. And even if one does not want to look for parallels between life and work, uh, I think this was a retort to the sort of treatment that she got from Rabindranath Tagore, her brother. Now, when this Kahake was translated in 1930 and published as unfinished song, Rabindranath wrote to William Rothenstein, the publisher, saying, "She's one of those unfortunate beings who has more ambition than his ability, just enough talent to keep her alive for a short period. Her weakness has been taken advantage of by some unscrupulous literary agents in London, and she has had stories translated and published. I have given her no encouragement, but have not been successful in making her see things in proper light." So much for the progressiveness of the Tagore family of Bengal. The next chapter deals with travelogues, one that deals with uh, travels of Prushunamoy Devi within India, which is called Arjavartu, and the other text is by Krishna Bhavini Dasi, who writes about her travels in England. And what I've tried to show is how uh, this space of travel was used by women writers to formulate a nation uh, ridden by various differences, and there was we find that they are not very eulogistic about the concept of love and home, comparing it with that of England. And in the conclusion, I'll not take much time. In the conclusion of the text, I've tried to make a critical evaluation of the reception of women authors' texts and diverse patterns of consumption to map the reading community in Renaissance Bengal. And we find, okay, I'll just read one that a text which was reviewed, Shona Kumari Devi's text, which was reviewed in Indian Mirror, which was the organ of the Brahmo Samaj, the Samaj which was considered to be quite liberal compared to the Hindi society. And Shona Kumari Devi's Chinna Mukul uh, was reviewed. uh, the reviewer writes, "The style is, as is characteristics of this writer, chaste, clear, sweet, and vigorous. Almost all characters are extremely natural, especially Konu, the heroine of the story. She is an admirable portrait of self sacrifice and disappointed love. Instances of such grand women heroism and abnegation of self liberate the fancy and gladden the hearts." So that's what the readers, typically male, wanted to see the characters to be. Even the characters had to be uh, women who acted as reservoirs of two values: a lady with a lamp disseminating sweetness, light. And I'll end with a review uh, that came out in the extremely high and exacting journal Bongodarshan, which was edited by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and Sanjeev Kumar Chattopadhyay. In this, Mukhodayani Mukhopadhyay's first collection of poem, Bonoproshun has been reviewed, and in that you have a humorous poem titled Bangalir Babu, which brought rave reviews. Mukhodaini was sarcastic towards the emancipated Babu, who was to her vainglorious, slavish. And let us look at the critique written by none other than Bankim Chattopadhyay. Uh, he writes, despite the use of the surname Mukhopadhyay, the readers must have understood that this work is not written by any Mr. Mukherjee, but Srimati Mukhodaini Devi. The epithet of Devi, which pleases goddess Shoti, Saraswati, and Lokhi, leaves Srimati Mukhopadhyay discontent. We abstain from entering into an altercation. We do not intend to be a match for women in that field. I am always afraid to praise poetic composition by women since it might instigate other women to desert their household duties and take up the pen. I hope Srimati Mukhopadhyay will condone me if I am not over generous in praising her work. Her poem Bangalir Babu has been published with some diligence. Hope the author would forgive such audacity. So, the sarcastic comment and the critique that came up in one of the most exacting journals uh, does declare the arrival of the category of women authors in Renaissance Bengal. Whatever their contemporary receptivity, it was their negotiation with hegemonic discourses on literary work, traditional values, experimentation with modern possibilities that allow and inspire women authors who write their history of contestation. So we need to acknowledge these resistance, these subversions, and even compromises of these literary foremothers, which we can claim to be a very powerful and complex inheritance that we have. Thank you so much. That's all that I have to say about my work. Over to Shuvatri.
Thank you so much, Professor Murmu, for that very engaging overview that I'm sure will give our audience a very broad idea of what your work deals with and makes my task much easier as the discussant of your book. So, without further ado, let me just start by saying that one of the most pioneering characteristic of your methodology, in words of her own, is of course intersectionality, and the way in which you constantly draw your readers' attention to intersectional hierarchies between caste, class, and gender goes a long way in contributing to historiography, radically altering the way, of course, we think about women's histories or caste histories. The 1980s witnessed the rise of intersectionality as a lens for articulating Black feminist struggles, especially with the publication of course, Selma James's Sex, Race, and Class, and then Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class in 1981. Now, this arose in response to and in conjunction with the Marxist attempt to project intersectionality as opposed to, generalizing experiences under the broad blanket category of class exploitation. Now, the project of intersectionality identified connections between racist, homophobic, capitalist, and sexist models of exploitation and focused on empirical experiences of oppression rooted in specific spatio-temporal context. In the context of South Asia, Uma Chakraborty's work on Brahmanical patriarchy, of course, introduced caste oppression within the lens of intersectionality. Within the larger field of general gender history, however, little work has appeared before yours which has extensively implemented this framework. Your work brings to light previously marginalized groups, such as women and lower caste groups, as agents of historical change. Through women's writing, it centers the category of experience and theorizes on the totality of hierarchical structures which facilitate the oppression, in this case, a Brahminical capitalist colonial patriarchy. The way I read it, your work addresses two central questions, which I would like to hear a little bit on to kind of start off the conversation with today. How can we think of histories which narrate experiences of hierarchical oppression and document resistance in the face of exploitation? And from that, how can we glean emancipatory hope from these histories so that we can make a better world. I'm, of course, forced to wonder that is writing histories of women and recovering words of their own, as you say, from the patriarchal and casteist silencing in archives, itself an act of resistance on the part of the historian. In this regard, how has your own positionality as an Adivasi woman of color in an academic world that is ridden with discrimination shaped your trajectory as a scholar and as a historian?
A lot of things been woven into one, and well, my topic, the words of her own. Uh, this is something that I've already spoken about, the fact that I wanted to work on music history, and I was not allowed by the chairperson, saying that I'm an Adivasi and not even an insider, so I could not work on classical music. So, so I thought that it's time that I move on to the other marginal section within the much valorized uh, Renaissance. So these Bhadra Mohilas themselves, they were empowered in the sense they were related to men who did make a difference in 19th century Bengal. But despite that, the sort of uh, anxiety, stress that they went through, the sort of critiques that they faced, even from the likes of Tagore, who had no reason to be unsure of his popularity, despite that, what he did towards his own sister, his debate with Ramabai Ranade. So I thought that this needed to be brought out, and archives. I thought that okay, data are very important, and how do we wean certain things out of data and give flesh and blood to it? And that is why I thought women, their own words are very important, and not to understand women's condition from those of uh, male writers, but their own contestations and possibilities that they were experimenting with. As to being an Adivasi individual, no, this is the fact that I do not have much love for data is because uh, unless you have human intervention, we are losing humanitarian touch from our academic work, and it's our humane obligation to transcend the uh, academic structured academic self. We need to be fluid individuals transgressing boundaries. And over here, I'd like to quote a poem by Dr. Rabha Flavian Kaka, who we lost uh, during the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. It's called I'm Not Your Data. Uh, I'm not your data, nor am I your vote bank. I am not your project or any exotic museum object. I am not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor am I the lab where your theories are tested. I am not your cannon fodder, or the invisible worker, or your entertainment at India Habitat Center. I'm not your field, your crowd, your history, your hell, your guilt, medallions of your victory. I refuse, reject, resist such labels, your judgments, documents, definitions, your models, leaders, and patrons, because they deny me my existence, my vision, my space. Your words, maps, figures, indicators, they all create illusions and put you on pedestal from where you look down upon me. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. I make my own tools to fight my own battle for me, my people, my world, and my Adivasi self. So this was there with me since 2011. So, but this was towards the end of my work that I came across this poem by Kaka, and so I thought that I had to weave in the anxieties the compromises, the humiliations that I had to uh, face in my own life, despite the Santals are the largest Adivasi groups in West Bengal, and I come from quite a privileged background, having studied in presidency and Jawaharlal University. Despite that, the sort of academic untouchability that I've suffered all throughout when I came back to West Bengal to work. So all these went into the making of this book, and as you said, resistance is all that is there to hope for. And the Adivasis, as you know, Chhattisgarh, this is the second highest militarization in the country happens there after Kashmir. So it's like I come from such a region. Uh, I might not me as in I'm born in West Bengal, but I am obviously at one with these people. So I think, as I said, one has to transcend one's immediate academic goals and try to live a livable life. So that's how it goes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that deeply moving and inspiring response, as always, Professor Murmu. I mean, I have been extremely honored to kind of witness your work over the last couple of years, a little bit more, perhaps 3 or 4 years now. And kind of, it always reminds me of these four lines that you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies, but you may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. And and that I think it bears testament to the very significant work that you do, not just in terms of writing, but in terms of your activism, your entire person, and as you very rightly summarized, live a very humane life. So one of the central contributions to which your work draws the reader's attention is not just the ways in which women's work within the space of the household has been kind of devalued and marginalized, but their very lives, their very existence has been historically invisibilized and devalued. For this, you reread colonial archives such as census reports, Risley's work, correspondences in a novel way, and argue that women were dehumanized to such an extent that their very existence was lost in the archives of history. Their numbers weren't counted, their deaths weren't recorded. So, as far as women's work in the household is concerned, you show how literary or intellectual pursuit was often considered to be an impediment for their kin making work. And by kin making, I mean the kind of work that, Marxist feminist scholars have argued that women put in this work to strengthen kinship ties to family by caring for members of the household, care becoming a very central category. And this work has, of course, been privatized within the household and in turn invisibilized. Through my research on the history of marriage, I've encountered the category of jotno, which you also often talk about, and I translate that as care, which is often kind of juxtaposed with obohela, disregard, or ojotno as a lack of care. And I'm wondering, and you do a wonderful job of showing this in your work, that intellectual pursuits undertaken by women, whether that be Sharna Kumari's novels or Sharada Sundari's autobiography or travelogues by Bongonari, by their very definition, an active resistance against invisibilizing and devaluing care work.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for pointing this out. True, like even the first autobiography that was written, Amar Jibon by Dr. Sundari Devi, it talks about unpaid domestic work. Ironically, it's the hidden engine that drives economies, business, societies. You are expected to contribute to the individual well-being as well as the well-being of the community, while your work is not recognized. So your work is undervalued, unaccounted worldwide, as you just said. So this unpaid domestic services, unpaid care work, as you call it, is also what are the main barriers that prevented women from getting into and progressing uh, in the labor force, as also in the field of writing. Like, they were expected that women would not, and most of the writers, they were very assertive that they wrote only when they got leisure hours. They took care of the home and then went on to uh, do their writing. So I felt that this creative labor, if we can call it, it's also very important. That doesn't get recognized also. So sort of unpaid labor of love, if you can say. That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, because this highlights the very that scholars these days have been talking about the paradox of neoliberal capitalism. That capitalism undervalues the very labor that it depends on. That if women didn't care for the wage laborers in the space of the household, then those laborers will not be exploited by the capitalist and the system to function. And whenever I read this literature, I always feel that this contradiction is not neoliberal, but it's a contradiction that has always historically existed. The women's work has always been devalued, yet it plays such a central role in sustaining human society, politics, world, environment, everything as we know it. And I think your work in that regard does such a wonderful job of uncovering these labors of love, as you wonderfully put it. Just a brief note on last point on methodology before I move on to the most hopeful part of the book, and I'll just get to that in a second. And you did touch upon this a little bit in the earlier section today as well, which is about the diversity of the genres and the modes of women's writing that you look at in your work. And how does that inform your method? For example, you often cite farces intertextually, which are not by women, presumably, because sometimes they're anonymous as well. The question of anonymity, the sort of multiplicity of genres, I'm wondering if this is an attempt to incorporate intersectionality in a work which focuses centrally on women's writing, but also takes into account all these other kinds of sources. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, like some of the things that I have not taken up in this book is the poems that I had collected, the plays that I had collected, because this would anyway, the book is so uh, anyway, it's humongous. So I couldn't add to it. So the thing is that I felt that there is some interconnectivity between the genres, and I tried to see how different are they when women are speaking about mostly about their domestic experiences apart from the travelogues. Are they expressing themselves in different ways when they are traversing across various genres? Are they changing? So I thought that's very necessary to see. And I like if I've taken Kailash Pashini Devi's Hindu Mohila Ganer Hinavastha, which is almost one of the first books that have been written. In 1863, I have also taken 1898 Kailash Pashini Devi's Kahake. I too, this was my journey also. I wanted to see how women, how assertive have they become at the end of the century, to say, yeah. So this growth, this development, women were resisting initially in their discursive tracks. So how fruitful was it in the, at least in the creative domain, where in creative literature, where they could allow their imagination to fly? How free was the imagination to fly? How receptive was the sky? How allowing was it? So that's what I wanted to see. Yeah.
Yeah, because there has been a recent conversation about decolonizing gender history and gender theory for that matter. And then that leads us to a whole different conversation on what exactly do we mean by theory, what exactly constitutes theory. And when I was reading your work, and also when I read all of these 19th century women's writing as my primary sources for research as well, I'm often struck that women's diaries are often deeply theoretical and abstract, which you mention in terms of looking at works that are being produced in the domestic space, but also travelogues which are being produced beyond the domestic space. And in a way, it moves beyond the colonial trope, which kind of tries to keep them within the space of the household as essentially private, essentially domestic. But through their writing, I often feel that these women are essentially communicating the fact, consolidating the fact that their abstract insights, their theoretical kind of observations on life, whether that be within the household or whether that be beyond the household, make very significant contributions to kind of decolonizing the canon of gender theory as we know it. And so, in that regard, I feel if Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex or The Inseparables is part of the canon, then perhaps for me, as a feminist and kind of somebody, a feminist of color for that matter, all of us, Ashwarna Kumari Devi, travelogue on England, Bangunari, all of that can be part of the way in which we can kind of think about decolonizing gender theory from the global south. And that, I think, is again one of the very significant contributions of the kind of work you've done in Words of Your Own. And now I will turn to the most hopeful part of your work, which for me is the way in which you draw on the radical potential of love, or unruly desire, if you will, to break apart hierarchies of caste, class, and even gender. And as I mentioned briefly before, my research deals with the political economy of Hindu marriage by looking at it through global capital and patriarchy, in an attempt to argue that the liminality of the institution of marriage between private and public sphere, male and female lifers, legal and customary practices, has kind of obfuscated its centrality in socio-political and economic histories of empire. Through this kind of historically contextualized investigation of Hindu marriage, I kind of look at larger shared vocabularies within different forms of heteronormative union. And I attempt to establish the importance of uncovering these histories of marriage, not just as legal or gender histories, but as the origin point of private property ownership and capitalist and patriarchal exploitation in human history. In your work, you showed that if marriage and conjugality was a way to reinforce oppressive caste, ethnicity, religion based communities, which can be seen in manuals of domesticity, tracts on marriage, even periodicals on Hindu matchmaking, then love and desire emerge as a force which has the potential to break these hierarchies. Whether these be instances of Sneholata's radical resistance by asserting bodily purity for her lover and refusing to consummate her marriage with her octogenarian Kulin husband, or whether it was instances of Sharna Kumari Devi and Girindra Mohani Dashi's deeply affective exchange, which you term as a lesbian continuum. These desires continue to remain at odds with attempts to discipline and regulate oppressive communities. In what ways do you think women resolve or address these contradictions between defiant desire on one hand and the pressure to conform to norms of Brahminical patriarchy on the other hand? And how did these tensions shape the grammars of marriage, desire, and conjugality in colonial Bengal?
Okay, as to the shaping, we do find a number of instances where women in colonial Bengal itself, women, and I think Apurna Bandyopadhyay, she's done a wonderful work on it.
That was my
So
reference to defiant desire. Aparna Dees, of
defiant
course.
desire,
It's
yeah, yeah,
fine.
she's done. So women did these way I think the fertile soil was actually tilled by these women writers who were actually talking about the fact that the woman is supposed to create a loving home out of a loveless marriage, and how could uh, what sort of an expectation can that be? The fact that they don't get to decide, there's no consent in the marriage. Uh, the fact that they are just thrown into an institutional structure which is oppressive all throughout. Um, Even Kailash Vaishni Devi, when she talks about the loving relationship she had, she does talk about the sort of oppressions that were there, the limitedness of female solidarity that she was pressed into, and things like that. So it's like. The people out there, and I find that these women, in most of the cases, they were ambiguous. uh, the work that Apurnadi does about a period much later is women uh, actually moving out of the house with their loved ones. It's just not in the uh, creative world that they do it, but we do have to accept that transgressions were always there, because we did get to hear about abortion, feticide, infanticide, that happened in Bengal because of Kulin polygamy, child marriage. That these were social issues, and unfortunately, scholarly work has been done to show that Vidyasagar's concern was more towards restricting this sexual uh, transgression rather than a humanitarian concern. So that was there. So it's like these women actually, through their works, tried to make the future uh, a little more possible than it was in 19th century Bengalia.
Absolutely. The other point, which calls for a brief discussion, is the theme of temporality in women's life world, which is something you refer to in on almost every instance of women's writing that you analyze. You mentioned that women conceptualize time not in a rational, linear, often capitalist way, but they personalize it through events such as birth, death, marriage as moments of rupture. And I'm wondering, can we think of these kind of temporal abstractions as anti-capitalist and anti-colonial in a world where timekeeping is becoming a tool of, capitalist colonial exploitation? Is this a way of women's resistance?
Yeah, but moving away from the teleological, progressive, temporal dimensions that have been used in history, we do find women talking about events being more important to a woman's life than and progress. The where was the progress in the first place in a woman's life in 19th century? So it's like they actually question the sort of idea about teleology and temporality and time that was there. The fact that you have the chakri coming in 19th century, the world of the babus were regulated by the clock, and the women, they were actually trying to defy it, and they were actually trying to snatch away time from the drudgery that was forced on them, leisure time to write a bit about whatever they felt like, to vent at least, because they did not have any other uh, comprador or companionship that one could think of. So that sort of a sisterhood even then. So I would say that their imagining of time uh, anyway had to be experimental and based rather than the long teleological progressive lens that one sees, because in fact, where has there been progress? Even if you see now, and we were talking about on screen existence, women are supposed to take care of everything and then go on to do online things, while others in the family, they go on with their online things and think that is very important. So where's progress anyway? We have to, as women, we all always need to be very critical about the concept of time. Time is money, sort of a thing, that is a capitalist construct. So, and the unpaid care service that we were talking about.
That's why the concept of temporality in Hindu marriage and the way sort of women conceptualize it is a theme in my own research as well. I often engage with it because I think of Satyajit Ray's poem Khuror Call, and how within that I kind of see that, there is this promise of gratification, but it's a gratification that will never happen. One is eternally doomed to chase it. And that in itself is the spirit of colonial capitalism. Shuvatri writes this in the 1930s. And that for me brings out the kind of commodification of time as money. That, oh, if the device is attached to the person will always run and not waste time in talking to other commuters on the way. So I think that kind of, it's a children's poem, but as usual, I think it does such a wonderful job of bringing this temporal politics of colonial capitalism out, and doesn't talk about women's care work, of course, but that's something I think for us that's something for us to do through our own research. And when we have works like yours, I feel it always shows the way as to where we're headed. Um, that brings me to one of the broader points that I wanted to hear from you today. And first, I will kind of pose the question and then I'll situate the question in the broader context that I was thinking about. Is that how has your effective political organizing on one hand, and I'm thinking especially during the last elections in Bengal, or your social work in Hingolganj, whatever little I know of it from your social media over the last years, and your research as a historian of caste and gender, and your pedagogy, your teaching methods, your supervision activities as a PhD dissertation supervisor, how does all of this form on one united spectrum? What I mean is, one way in which you do that, and I think this is so powerful, is when you talk about the taboo against mental health, and how often mental health is kind of portrayed as an individual idiosyncrasy, but you always bring attention to the fact that these are resulting from larger structures of oppression. And so an individual is not responsible for it, but there are larger histories of oppression behind it. So to kind of bring the whole thing together, what I mean is there is individual experience, and that is being, staged by intersectionality as an approach. And then there are these broader histories of oppression. And I'm often, and this is something, I often think about in my own work, life, all of it, is how do we bridge the gap between individual and the community, and in what ways can we use experience at the same time of the individual and of the community to kind of rewrite the poetry of a radical emancipatory future which will make for a better world. And I can't think of anyone better suited than you to tell us a little bit more about
Not
this.
really. I do very little. Uh, now, the one that you were talking about, I keep harping about caste atrocities and mental health, their interrelation. I would also try to point out that when I was working at Hingolganj during this Amphan and
Exactly.
yeah. So well, what we used to hold our medical camps, and we realized that these people, they were hallucinating, and uh, they were actually uh, facing a lot of stress, and they were instances where they were imagining a lot of pain as well. So these people, they cannot spend money on stress, mental health, depression, but they are uh, the ones who are at the receiving end. They are the ones who actually allow the liberties that we get in the urban life, the comfort that we get, but they are the ones who, through every um, natural calamity, they lose their agency. Uh, with the lockdown coming in, they became all the more fatalistic. But we do remember that Hingolganj being an area which is based on a single crop, monocrop area, most of the people out there, they are migrant laborers, and couples work in different districts. Uh, so it's like they actually, if there was so much of helplessness and hopelessness, we did find the heroic return back to their home, the sort of agency that they reclaimed by coming back to uh, their home in Hingolganj, partly washed away, broken, but they were ready to face the unknowable future that was there. So, another reason is that the fact, the sort of untouchability that I talk about, even in a village like in a Sundarban like Hingolganj, you find the Adivasis on the fringes, and they live near the river. So it's like they are the ones whose houses are washed away. uh, because of the calamities that Sundarban faces every now and then. So that obviously, so I always felt that every one of us need to do a little bit out of. It's just not the factor that these are the ethnic communities who I feel attached to in Hingalganj because of the caste factor, but also the fact that it is the women. We all know that it is the women who are most affected during these calamities. So it's and so that's how I try to uh, bring in my academics, my activism and environment. We are trying to uh, run environment friendly uh, stitching sort of a jute bags and all that that's done by the girls of Mom Sundarban. So we are trying to help them in whatever little way so that they can economically sustain themselves. These women who are anyway have to face the lockdown and the natural calamity. So without, as you know, without economic empowerment, nothing helps. So that's everything. The little bit that we can all do, I think.
No, absolutely. And I mean, maybe 50 years from now, if we do our, and the way you're doing it, of course, some historian will write their stories as well. So it always makes sense to me that this very significant work that you're doing in terms of facilitating economic empowerment of women, or facilitating the ways in which we can make a better world, so that contributions they're doing in terms of their own livelihood, but also making sure that we live a little bit better in a more humane way, as you mentioned in the beginning. I think that informs our research practices very significantly. If I correct me if I'm wrong here, I remember very briefly when we spoke back in 2019, you were working on some kind of project to collate data about caste compositions of students in rural students or teachers. I cannot remember at this moment, but you were doing some very crucial work, I remember. And I asked you back then as well, and I'm just going to bring that back into sort of the way in which this feeds. I think these projects that you're doing, and these other things that you're doing, and also the political organizing that you're doing, all of this kind of feeds into the larger arguments of words of our own in very significant ways. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, yeah. So as I keep saying in my public talks, that it's after the institutional murder of Rohit Vemula that I started talking about the caste atrocities in West Bengal. And so I tried to find, I know what I have gone through in the state. So I thought I should talk to academics in other institutes, in research institutes and university spaces, what they have undergone, their lives. And I did interview a lot of them, and they've all spoken about how traumatic the school life has been, how their when they did good in studies, it was assumed that they must have cheated. The sort of disbelief, the fact that they had to give up their identity since we have a different language, way of dressing up, speaking, eating, whatever. They tried to, so that the mainstream embraces us, and the sort of untouchability, academic or professional, or untouchability, social untouchability. So social distancing has been a constant for us. So this is nothing new for us. So that has always been there. So I did that, and I also worked on the institutional to see how I've taken up in launch to see how Adivasi students, they were institutionally drawn into the educational structure. What are there? Why do they drop out? There's very high dropout rate. Why do they drop out from the institutional spaces? That's also there. And the other thing, that my political activism uh, against the big farmers and things like that, the Adanis, Ambanis, the retail chains, and uh, that has to be there, because I do believe in environmental activism, and I think this nothing can be a eye opener for all of us, because we learn nothing. So, but then we've seen how helpless we are before the pandemic and the virus that's there. So it's like we have harmed the earth enough, and she is striking back. Even if I'm called a fatalist, I don't mind. I believe this is the earth striking back. So that's there. Also, the fact that CAA and all that is there, uh, it's the Dalits, Adivasis, the minorities, the Muslims, and others. We do not have papers to produce. And imagine these people who are regularly every year, if there's a flood or natural calamity, they move from one place to the other. So it's like, how do you expect these people to produce papers? So it's like, it's also very intimate to my own existence as well. The fact that the people that I call my own would have a very would have a very bleak fate. Anyway, the Forest Rights Act actually led to a lot of displacement. So it's like you were talking about traumas. We carry intergenerational traumas. So it's like it's very important that we try to weave in everything. Yeah.
And I think through that trauma, this kind of exercise in archiving that you're undertaking, not just writing about archives from the 19th century and how that silences women's voices, but actually consciously creating an archive of caste-based violence and exclusion. I cannot emphasize how important this exercise that you've undertaken is going to be for future generations of historians and for us to kind of live in a better world, a better tomorrow. I the argument about the fatalist argument about the earth striking back, it resonates with me, but I find myself vehemently believing in a better tomorrow, and that is only because people like you, scholars like you, activists like you, continue to work every single day. And that kind of brings me to my last sort of conclusive reflections, and you've already touched upon it by bringing it up on the question of the environment. So I believe in the recent years there has been a lot of conversation on the anthropocentric nature of history writing. Works by Jadavpur, Milindo Banerjee center on how we can learn from indigenous communities such as the Nagas and the non-human communities such as Yaks and Cranes, how to care for the world better. And you also mentioned it in your own work that there are these communities of women in Hingolganj who are doing their little bit to kind of contribute for the environment. And scholars such as Tom Van Duren, Donna Haraway have incorporated the paradigm of care work done by women in the household to include also caring for the non-human and for the world. Do you think that the anthropocentrism, the obliteration of non-human, the exploitation of natural resources, which is of course the basic definition of capitalist exploitation of nature, kind of and the kind of obliteration of the non-human in history writing results from Brahminical patriarchy? Because as we know, lower caste groups, Adivasis in South Asia, have always existed, and women has always existed in synchronicity and alongside non-humans. Whether that be from mothers taking care of pet dogs and cats in the neighborhood to like women worshipping trees, or being one of the first groups to take up environmental movements in India, as we know from the Chipko struggle and all. Do you think that as we come face to face with an emerging climate crisis, a pandemic, we can learn to do better from these communities?
Yeah, the thing is, the sort of hypermasculinity that we have come to celebrate, uh, to take on whatever comes our way, the sort of imperialism, human imperialism that we are trying to reign on this earth. uh, I think there's a backlash, and the Mother Earth, as you call her, so she's trying to reclaim her own space. So I was talking about not climate refugees as such, but the women with whom I work in Sundarban. Uh, so it's like the government now is recognizing, giving some recognition to women who are called seed guardians, Beach Mata, and they're being given Bharat Ratna and Bharat whatever the government can bestow them with. But the fact is that Adivasis have always been conservationists. Uh, they have now organic food has become so very popular. It's the in thing, but this is something we have practiced for ages. Um, through my work, activist work, I talk against genetically modified seeds, GMOs, the ill effects of fertilizers, pesticides. So it's like the community, the indigenous community, they are into so-called organic farming for a very long time. So it's a necessity that it's just not recognition at times at official levels, but the fact that you're displacing Adivasis. There are two projects that are going on in West Bengal now, Devchapachami and the Purulia pump storage. You are displacing Adivasi, and then you are giving a token Beej Mata and this sort of epithets to women. This does not help if you do not we do not actually try to curb our capitalist greed. Then there's no way where how we can survive actually. There's this the hope that we've been talking about. There's we are marching towards hopelessness actually if we do not mend our ways. So uh, true that the sort of Brahminical patriarchy, that the superiority of the humans, the sort of Anthropocene uh, projection that has been made is actually harming, in the long run, is harming all of us.
Absolutely. Well, I will end on that note by warmly thanking you once again, Professor Murmu, for this wonderful conversation, for engaging extensively with my questions on your monograph and on its making in the larger socio-political context, and of course, once again to Sean Sully and In Narratives for facilitating this virtual platform today, and with the hope that someday this will once again take place in person in a post-pandemic better world that we have coming up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Shanchali, for giving us an opportunity to interact. Been waiting for this for long because the pandemic came in and I never got an opportunity to meet Shuvatri. So thank you for at least virtually bringing us together on the same platform.
Thank you to both of you. I mean, this was such an insightful session, and just 2 hours or 1.5 hours do not do justice to this. So, but still, this was a very, very interesting discussion, and thank you to both of you, and also for those who joined. And so, this is going to be saved on the channel, so anyone could just go and watch it if they want. Thank you once again.
Okay, then. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so
Okay, then.
I'll just end.